Hey there everyone, it's Ted Thatcher, the president of Bright Lake Wealth Management. I wanted to bring you the market update for this month headed into October. First, I wanted to talk about the Fed. I've gotten a lot of questions about this big change that Jerome Powell discussed coming out of the latest Fed meeting in the middle of September. Essentially, Jerome Powell announced that they're going to be reducing the federal funds rate, starting to bring that rate down over time. He took a large step by not just lowering the federal funds rate by 25 basis points, but he actually lowered it a full 50 basis points. And what this means is that the interest rate teeter-totter that we've heard about over and over and over again over the last several years is now actually headed in the other direction with this change from the Fed. And of course, the common phrase, "don't fight the Fed," immediately comes to my mind. Of course, when we think about investment strategy, we really don't want to fight the central bank of the United States of America. It has historically been understood to be the most powerful financial entity in the world and across time. And so strategically, we want to be thoughtful about this large change when it comes to financial strategy. Now, naturally, as a follow-up to such a large change from the central bank, I have gotten a lot of questions about how the economy is doing. There's so many different ways to measure how the economy is doing. We could look at GDP here in the United States. We could look at the values we're seeing in the financial markets. But I think it's impossible to have a conversation about how the American economy is doing without actually keying in and looking at the average American consumer. And the truth is the average American consumer has been really beaten down by the constant inflation that we've seen over the last several years. And so when I zoom in to the American consumer, I look at the consumer sentiment figures, which have declined very recently, and I look at the numbers that surround average Americans. There's now over $1 trillion in credit card debt that Americans are carrying. 60% of Americans can't come up with $1,000 to pay an unexpected bill. And so it has become the case that on average, Americans aren't just living paycheck to paycheck anymore. They're living credit card payment to credit card payment, it seems. And so we do want to think about the difference between what's happening on Wall Street and what's happening on Main Street, because many would say it's impossible for those to be very, very, very far apart for an extended period of time. And because of this big discrepancy and the dichotomy between Wall Street and Main Street, I think the question that I've been getting often as a follow-up to that is, Ted, are we in a recession or are we going into a recession? And ultimately, when we get questions like that, typically what I'll come back to is, are we managing risk properly? Because it really is impossible to time the financial markets just perfectly every time. You know, what we're looking at are some of the big picture changes, right? The Fed has gone through this large interest rate hiking cycle, the largest in 35 years, 3.5 decades, essentially a generation. And they did that within 18 months, incredibly quickly. And when we see that, historically speaking, the federal funds rate being hiked up can correlate with recessions. And so when the yield curve's inverted, when we see the Fed make such a drastic change, there are some markers out there that are reasonable to say, hey, are we gonna be okay in terms of the values that we're seeing in the markets? And so when we see such a big change from the Fed, when we see the yield curve still being inverted, it does remind us that, hey, there's a little bit of a bulb flashing to say, hey, let's make sure we're managing risk properly and that everything is tailored really to what we need right now. Those things, combined with an election coming up this November, should serve as a great reminder that we want to make sure our risk is properly aligned with where we are in our financial life. With all the information and new data that gets released week by week by week, when we see it in the news headlines and on social media posts and all the different places we consume information today, it's so hard to figure out what is actually being sensationalized and what is really good information for us. My goal with these updates is to help you sift through all those headlines and actually figure out what might be most important for you and what's going on with your money, so that you can actually be more confident and have hope in a bright future.